mama killed a chicken, thought he was a duck. Put him on the table with his legs sticking up. You got to bundle up and go. Yeah, you got to bundle up and go. Well, you hire a pile of women, show got to bundle up and go.
There is perhaps no one who stands as a greater example of neoclassical art, in painting at least, than Jacques-Louis David. We will talk about him not just in this lecture, but we'll revisit him again in the next one, because he arrives on the scene at a very important time. He arrives on the scene as the French Revolution is whispered about. He's there as the French Revolution continues. And then he's there for Napoleon Bonaparte's reign afterward. So he's an important figure that we'll look at for a bit. And I don't want to dive too much into this painting because we're going to talk about it much more in depth the next time we meet one another. But it is such a good example of neoclassical art that we really have to look at it. And this is the Oath of the Hierati from 1783 to 1784. And we're not going to talk about its purposes just yet, because it has very specific propaganda purposes. What we are going to look at, however, is how it displays those characteristics that we were just talking about, right? You have a sternness, right? Seriousness, morality kind of story. At least morality in the sense of French bourgeois at the time. But everything's stern, everything is stable, right? Our individuals over here are all standing in this almost triangle-like stance, which makes them very sturdy to the ground. Right? We have the heroic male figure, specifically in the father, but we can also see it a bit in the younger men here. We have a story that is an ancient Roman story, hence why everyone's dressed like they're ancient Romans. We've got some ancient Roman architecture here in the back. We have that planarity that was talked about, right? Where, again, the surface of this painting is the picture plane, and everybody's lined up nice and perfectly, right along where they would be parallel to that picture plane. Let me see what other... hard edges and primary colors. Yeah, I mean, everybody looks like they could be made of sculpture. There's not the softness of Rococo. There's none of the flora in the background. Everything's really hard edged. And then we said primary colors. We've got reds. We've got some blues. Right? That's the kind of thing. There's not the creamy, beautiful, pastel-y kind of colors. This one we will talk about. This is The Death of Socrates from 1787. And it has also all of those different, let me move over here, all of those different characteristics that we're just talking about. It's an ancient Greek story, the story of the philosopher Socrates, who was tried and convicted of corrupting the youth and was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. He had hemlock poisoning. Socrates then becomes the heroic male figure, right? He's given all these classical Greek proportions to his body, made all super muscular, although by all accounts, the actual Socrates was kind of a little like trollish looking dude. But that doesn't fit the story. The story that's being told is to aspire to Socrates here. Again, we're leading up to the French Revolution. And David, the painter, David, is making a lot of work that is calling for people to join the cause and to fight for what you believe in. And here we have this heroic figure of Socrates who was willing to die rather than recant what he believed in. Also, Socrates was given an option. He didn't have to die. The other option was to leave Athens, where he lived at the time. And he absolutely wouldn't do that. He couldn't stand the idea of leaving Athens and living somewhere else. So that's also contained here, right? That nationality that we talked about, that nationalism, rather, that we talked about earlier on, right? That David certainly wants to take down the systems that are in place in France, but he doesn't want to get rid of France. He doesn't want to leave France. He believes in the nation that he lives in, but he thinks it could be better, and that it would be better if we sort of took down the people who are the elite, who are in power, and replaced it with something new that would take into consideration the people. So we're given that, right? In the again, this heroic male figure. He is sternly and morally taking hemlock and willing to die for the things that he believes are correct and right. Then we have the plenarity. Everybody's lined up, like I mentioned, perfectly. It's an ancient Greek story. Right? We have, again, our primaries of red, blue, yellow, and those harsh, crisp edges on everything. There's nothing about this that's even remotely Rococo, right? From the moral lesson to just the aesthetic of it, right? There aren't those creamy pastels. There's not a sense of decoration within the piece. It's and like I said, it's meant to teach a lesson rather than taking joy in just sort of the living of life. Certainly nothing here is meant to be veiled eroticism, right? There's nothing like that happening here. It's meant to be a stern, on the surface kind of story, but the story is also meant to interlace and connect with the lives of the people who are currently living in France, who may be hungry, who may be starving, who may feel like they're underrepresented, what have you, as a call to stand up. And we have Angelica Kauffmann. Angelica Kauffmann was actually Swiss-born, but was painting in England. And as such, some of the rules about... let me go back. So we'll talk about this much more in depth, I think, also the next time we meet. But at the time, again, only women could receive training in art. I'm sorry, only men could receive training in art. And one of the big reasons why women had to get their training more informally was because women were not allowed to learn to draw from the nude model. And one of the rules that we'll talk about in a later lecture, one of the rules about history painting. Right, that's what this is. History painting is something that sort of arrives on the scene when it comes to the neoclassicism. And one of the rules of history painting was that you must draw all of your figures nude before painting all of the clothing onto them. So underneath both of these paintings, if we could just get down to the drawing level, David would have drawn each of these figures nude. In England, that wasn't a rule. And so Angelica Kauffmann comes along, and she's one of the few female artists, one of the few women artists who decided to paint history paintings and becomes known for it. And in fact, she, in England, is a founder of the Royal Academy of Art that exists to this day, and then sadly wasn't allowed to join it because she was a woman. Right? But the rules, at least, about drawing from the nude figure in order to make history paintings didn't exist in England. And so Angelica Kauffmann becomes known for her history paintings in England. Hers, however, interestingly, some of them at least do focus on women. A lot of them are still very patriarchal, very male-centered. But interestingly, she does have some pieces like this one, Cornelia presenting her children as her treasures from 1785, that do involve women. Now, the lessons are still very masculine. So, all right, so the story that's being presented here, it's an ancient Roman story. Before I even get there, here we are again, planarity, right? All the figures are lined up with the picture plane, right? Everything's very hard edged. There's maybe a little more softness to Angelica Kaufman's work, but still pretty hard edged. Fairly stern and moral. There's not all of that fluffy decoration of Rococo, and we have nice primary colors: reds, yellows, blues. All right, all that's there. The story that's happening here is we have, I forget this woman's name. This is Cornelia here in the middle. I forget this woman's name, and I forgot to write it in my notes. But anyway, this woman right here has asked, or rather is showcasing her jewelry as her treasures. This is the thing I treasure the most, and has asked Cornelia what is the thing she treasures the most. And so she presents her children, right? These are my treasures. These are the things that I treasure and hold dear. Now, that reinforces the notions that we've been talking about of the burgeoning middle class, the bourgeois in France, who see the gender roles as needing to be redefined from how the aristocracy defines them. Now, again, interestingly, that a story like that would be told because Kaufman herself is working in what would have been considered the public sphere, working in what would have been a man's realm. But she presents this scene here that reinforces that what a mother should be focusing herself on, what a woman and a mother should be focusing herself on, is her children. And in particular, in the case of this oldest one right here, I wish I could remember his name now. I should have written it down in my notes. But he is going to grow up to become the emperor of Rome, and is recognized as being a particularly good and benevolent emperor. So the story seems to suggest that it was because of Cornelia's dedication to and treasuring of her children and being that good mother that then allowed for him to grow into a kind and benevolent emperor. And here we have Zeuxis selecting models for his picture of Helen of Troy, which again reinforces perhaps the gender roles and the patriarchal Roman way of thinking about gender roles, and men as artists, women as objects to be looked at, kind of thing. But again, women just don't quite feature in a lot of neoclassical work as sort of the main focus, the way they do in Kaufman's work, right? In her work, women are central, even if they are, in this case, the models, right? Zeuxis is an artist who needs to paint a picture of Helen of Troy. And so he needs to find the most beautiful woman because, right, if it's Helen of Troy, she is this beautiful woman who, if she's so beautiful that Paris needs to steal her away and cause this whole big gigantic war, she must have been one hot lady. So he needs to find the most beautiful woman in order to be his model. So he is testing each of them and examining each of them, right? Still that planarity, still those hard-edged models, still those reds and blues. There's some greens in there in her case, and some browns, but still there's this sternness and this morality. That morality being, in this case, that a woman should prize and should be prized for her beauty and should upkeep that beauty. But I kind of like that while the artist is busy dealing with his models, there's one woman back here who's mixing his paints and getting ready right? She's his assistant. I like that little detail. Seems like Kaufman is maybe trying to say a little something with that lady back there. Then neoclassical architecture. As we mentioned, the staples of neoclassical architecture are going to be simple geometry: squares, rectangles, triangles, circles. Right? They're gonna want very simple, easy to understand geometry that feels nice and grounded. They like symmetry. Boy, do they love symmetry in neoclassical architecture. And combining with all that ancient Greek and Roman elements, because again, that would have been seen as the height of morality and the thing that we should aim for. So you get a piece like the Kenwood House here. This is a palace of the time, right? And I mean, look at it. It's symmetrical. It is extremely symmetrical. We draw a line right here, and everything that's on this side is echoed on this side. The geometry of it is so simple. There are squares, there are rectangles, there are curves, but those curves are perfect semicircles, right? The windows are rectangles, right? Everything is so simplified. And then we see some ancient Greek and Roman stuff being incorporated through these columns that have Ionic ordered capitals. And this pediment, this triangular pediment that comes straight out of Greek, but also was adopted into Roman architecture. It is meant to look very stern. It is meant to be very moral. It is meant to be very simple and not super flowery. Again, in opposition to what was happening in the Baroque era before it, right? Where we look at something like San Carlo here, which undulates and curves and swells and doesn't look like anything that had come before it, right? It is opulent and is flowery and showy. Over here, again, this is a palace. This was a church. This over here is a palace. And look at the simplicity of it. And the lack of adornment, the lack of anything that suggests haughtiness. Right? And I said this is a palace. This would have been a wealthy home, not so much a palace. We have here architect Jacques-Germain Soufflot, I believe. Forgive me if I pronounce that wrong. The Pantheon, which was originally the Church of Saint Genevieve, but eventually would be called the Pantheon because of its resemblance to the ancient Roman Pantheon. And again, it's symmetrical. Again, the way the photograph was taken, you can't tell perfectly over here, but again, if we drew a line right down the middle, everything on one side is echoed on the other side. Simple geometry, and where it is adorned, it is so adorned by things that resemble and are adopted from ancient Greek and Roman architecture. Again, these columns that have Corinthian order capitals on the top, this pediment, which looks so much like the ancient Greek Parthenon's pediment, with that statuary inside, and the dome on top being very Roman, but also getting some arches and Greek sort of styled things that are happening in that. And I talked about how many of the writers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were deists. They were deists because they were also living in the age of reason. And they were thinking about all these same kind of things that we were talking about that were happening in France. So it makes sense then that our capital, which was designed, it came about, everything was finally built and put in place a bit later, but all the designs and ideas for it came during the neoclassical period of time. And so a lot of the buildings that we sort of see as being iconically Washington and standing for the United States government have that neoclassical design to them. The White House, Look at the simple geometry of it, rectangles, squares, the symmetry of it, and those ancient Greek and Roman elements that have been incorporated into it. Again, these columns, the Ionic capitals, the pediment here. There's no statuary in it, but still, that triangular pediment is there. Right? I considered taking this one out because of the recent events that happened at the United States Capitol, but then I decided against it. I decided no, I'm gonna bring it up because it is such an excellent example of really high neoclassical architectural design. Yes, the United States Capitol was stormed by insurrectionists in January, and as a nation, we are going to have to deal with the consequences of that and what that means to us. All that's a separate conversation from what I'm talking about today. What I'm talking about today is that the designer, you'll notice Pierre Charles Lafont was French, designed this in a neoclassical style. Again, everything is so simple, so stern, so firmly rooted, right? Squares, rectangles, semicircles, right? Everything is simple in its geometry. And then we have the Roman and Greek elements that have been combined onto it. The Greek portico, the columns that are very Greek and Roman in nature, the dome, which is very Roman in nature. All of this is neoclassical because of the time period in which the country was founded. And even Thomas Jefferson, he considered himself to be quite the neoclassicist. And he was, yes, one of our founding fathers. He was the third president of the United States. He also considered himself kind of a Renaissance man, if you will. He considered himself a philosopher, a scientist, and an architect. He designed his home, Monticello, which is in Virginia, that he worked on throughout a number of years, beginning in 1772, and didn't really consider it finished until about 1809. And you can see that it has all the earmarks of neoclassical design, right? That symmetry, the simple geometry, there's that dome on top. He was also the architect for the University of Virginia. And if you ever have a chance to see any of that, it's also a really excellent example of neoclassical architectural design here in the United States. The Rococo and neoclassical styles are also translated into music. There's Rococo music, and then what we might consider neoclassical music is just referred to as classical music. And as such, if you ever hear someone refer to something as classical music, that's a term that kind of just generally gets used for any music that uses sort of traditional instrumentation or uses an orchestra, something like that. But the true classical era of music happens during this particular moment in time. So Rococo music, its characteristics, again, it was rejecting the Baroque solemnity of Baroque music. It's very highly ornamental. It's light, it's airy, it's whimsical, because of course it is. It was meant for people in the aristocracy or people in the nobility to dance to. It was designed for enjoyment, dance, and immediate appeal. It was meant to, you hear it, and there's nothing else really to think about, right? And that's not me trying to put it down. It's just that you're meant to enjoy it. You're meant to immediately recognize things like repeated melodies. You're supposed to pick up on those things very quickly, right? It would have been kind of like the pop music of its day, right? It's not aiming for any sort of grand intellectual heights. That's not the purpose of it. But two instruments come into vogue in Rococo music that at least one of which is still popular to this day: the harpsichord and the piano. The little musical piece that we'll listen to here is done on a harpsichord, and a piano was sort of a modified version of a harpsichord. Harpsichord, like a piano, has lots of wire within it and keys, a keyboard just like a piano. And when you would press a key, a little hook would come up and would strum the string. Whereas a piano has hammers inside that hit the strings. A piano gets its name for what it was originally called, which was a pianoforte, which literally meant soft loud. Because a piano, well, let's go back to the harpsichord. It was built on the design of a harpsichord, and a harpsichord could really only play at one volume. A piano, as you may or may not be aware, you can sort of change the timbre of. It can be played very softly. Those pedals that are down below can affect that. It can be played very loudly. You can hit the keys harder and get a louder noise because the hammers are coming down on the wires with more force. Whereas a harpsichord just kind of played at one singular volume, no matter how hard you press the keys or anything like that. So a piano, it was originally called a pianoforte. Over time, it just got shortened to piano, which literally just means soft. And that was a new instrument that was used for this work, and has continued to be a popular instrument to this day. But let's listen to a quick little piece. We won't listen to this entire thing. What I'll try to do is remember to have a link to this video in the material that I give you this week. Okay, and I don't know what was happening there. My connection didn't seem to want to let that video buffer. But anyway, yeah, again, to our 21st century ears, that may sound, or may not rather sound like pop music. But at the time, it's kind of what it would have been meant to be. And this was meant to be music that would be enjoyed within the homes of the aristocracy. It was meant to be danced to. It was meant to be enjoyed. Right? It was meant to elicit feelings of love and romanticism and things of that nature. Right? I need to click off of that. Classical music, on the other hand, sets itself up as an antithesis to that. Its characteristics are an emphasis on beauty, elegance, and balance. So in some ways, it's kind of the musical version of the architecture. There's more variety and contrast than in Rococo, right? Rococo doesn't want to go too wild in any direction because it's meant to sort of incorporate and be enjoyed by everyone listening. What classical music wants to do is stimulate your brain a little bit, right? Because again, it's the age of enlightenment, the age of reason. Your brain should be stimulated by the stuff that you partake in. So there's a lot more variety in things like tempo, key, mood, and timbre within classical music. And the composers of classical music come up with some new or updated forms, like the sonata, which is a composition in 3 sections: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. The symphony, that's what we connect with classical music, right? The symphony is developed during this time. It's an elaborate musical composition for a full orchestra, typically in 4 movements, at least one of which is traditionally in the sonata form that we just talked about. And opera becomes a big deal. It's a dramatic work in one or more acts set to music for singers and instrumentalists. Why does opera become a thing during the classical or neoclassical period? Well, because we know that the ancient Greeks and the Romans had plays that were sung, where the dialogue that's been handed down to us that we still have, we know would have been sung, would have had a tune, but we have no clue what that would have sounded like. The classical composers come along and they start thinking, well, what would that be like? What would that be like to have a dramatic story with a narrative and dialogue, but everything will be set to music and will be sung? That's how we arrive at this. So I'm going to give you a little bit right here. This is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's piece, A Little Night Music. You'll recognize it, I'm sure. Now, I want you to notice how the music started off with a very specific type of melody. And again, it's the one that you instantly recognize because you've heard it a million times. Now, where Rococo would have probably kept going with that melody and kept repeating it, in this piece, that melody changed. Then it changed its tempo and its mood. That's going to happen yet again here in just a second. Notice how you haven't heard anything repeat yet, right? There's not been a progression of notes that we've gone back to, like we did in Rococo music, and like what happens in a lot of popular music today. There are little snippets that he might eventually go back to, but you see Mozart changing it up, right? Every few seconds, it seems like the music changes into something different. It never wants to let you settle into something, right? Again, classical music was meant to be like brain music. It was meant to stimulate the brain. So Mozart and others like him don't want there to be a moment where you completely and utterly settle into a repeated melody, right? Something that's meant to just be enjoyed and sort of zone out. You know, they don't want that moment to happen for you. So variety happens. And we're already a minute and a half in, and nothing has repeated yet. Now, I'm not going to play the full thing. I will give you a link to this video so that you can listen to the piece yourself. But eventually, he's going to return to some motifs. A motif, M-O-T-I-F-F. That's a term that's used in art, in literature, and in music. A motif is something that gets repeated, right? Often for a certain effect. And there will be times later where he'll go back and he'll grab a motif, like a certain progression of notes that you heard earlier, and insert it. But maybe it's played at a slightly different tempo or with a slightly different mood, what have you. And just as a reminder, like, hey, we're still in that piece, but now let's play with it some more. Let's do some more with it. Okay, yep. And then I just wanted to give you a quick example of opera also from Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. This is a duet from the Marriage of Figaro from 1786. And similarly to classical music, the opera, as you'll notice, right, there's not like this one melody. It's not like a lot of music now where, right, like melody is king, right? The notes and the progression of notes change and flow in ways that, again, that are meant to be intellectually stimulating. And again, based on what they thought maybe this is what the ancient Greeks and Romans did. I don't know. Let's give it a try. Let's see. All right, so there it is. That's all I have for you. It was a lot, I know. I'll try to edit it down as much as I can. Anyway, yeah, so that's what you're responsible for from me. You'll also get some material from Professor McIntosh. Have a good week. Don't forget that we have quiz 4 coming up. I think it's 4, yeah. So study up for that. Take care, guys. Bye.